What happens when a president who once proclaimed to have the second most powerful army in the world is forced to publicly admit that he is running out of resources? That is exactly what Vladimir Putin is facing right now. The impact can be summarized in seconds. Russia, which once had overflowing war coffers, is now on the brink of bankruptcy. Oligarchs disappear under mysterious circumstances and $50 billion are confiscated while the world watches an entire empire begin to wobble. This is the harsh reality of an economy strangled by sanctions, bombarded by drones, and corroded by internal power struggles. It is also the reality of a man resorting to what dictators have done throughout history, eliminating oligarchs and seizing their fortunes. But how did it come to this? Putin's war against Ukraine, according to his promises, was supposed to end in 3 days. 4 years later, not only are his troops stuck in a quagmire, but the entire Russian economy is stagnating. Western sanctions are beginning to have a tangible effect, and President Donald Trump's announcements about possible secondary sanctions against Putin's supporters, such as China and India, are shaking the Kremlin. At the same time, oil revenues decline day by day, as Ukraine relentlessly attacks refineries, ports, and now also Russian oil tankers with drones. This suffocating economic blow is drastically limiting Putin's room for maneuver. The consequences are devastating. Inflation soars, growth stagnates, and although Putin still officially talks about 4% growth in July, he himself poses the bitter question: is this enough? Is this the success we wanted? His words sound like an involuntary surrender, a confession that the Kremlin's propaganda promises lack substance. Instead of economic strength, only desperate solutions remain, one of which is the relentless attack on the super-rich. More and more oligarchs are dying under suspicious circumstances. It is said that one shot himself 6 times in the back of the head, a macabre Russian method that actually seems like a state-tolerated elimination manual. One particularly striking case was a man who ran the only Russian company producing carbon fibers for Shahed drones. A crucial supplier now dead, and Putin doesn't have to pay him another ruble. The historical similarities are inevitable. Mao resorted to expropriation. Saddam Hussein made his rivals disappear. And now Putin follows the same path. But unlike the start of the war, today he barely has options, because the money source is literally drying up. 1/5 of Russia's refining capacity has already been destroyed, leading to multi-million-dollar losses. Ukrainian drones now attack not only the domestic market but also the export routes through which Russian oil is sent to China, India, Turkey, and Brazil. Every port hit and every tanker set on fire represents a direct blow to Putin's personal bank account. Experts estimate that losses in the last month alone have reached $600 million. These figures explain why there is suddenly a massive outflow of capital from Russia. Oligarchs try to transfer their money abroad, sell shares, and move gold. However, the Kremlin has imposed strict measures. Exporting gold in quantities over 100 grams is prohibited. Billionaires are detained directly on their private jets before leaving the country. A gold magnate had to abandon his plane on the runway because Putin's officials intervened at the last moment to prevent him and his fortune from escaping. What is happening is not simply an economic crisis, but a ruthless struggle for survival at the highest level of state power. Putin needs money to continue the war, and also requires men to maintain resistance at the front. But the reality is that Russian citizens are not rushing to die for his imperial dreams. That is why the regime has created a perverse incentive system. Soldiers are lured with millionaire contracts. According to recent announcements, those who agree to go to Ukraine are offered an annual contract of 6 million rubles. Upon signing, they receive 2,500,000 rubles, equivalent to about $30,000. A huge sum compared to the average Russian salary, which barely exceeds $500 a month. Monthly pay at the front is around $3,500, 7 times that of an ordinary worker. But this luxury comes at a cost. The life expectancy of a soldier at the front is on average only a few days. An entire battalion of recruits becomes cannon fodder in a matter of days. Still, there are volunteers, because Putin's economy is so devastated that many see no other way out. Those who don't fight barely manage to work in arms factories, which are funded with freshly printed money to produce weapons and ammunition. A macabre cycle. The collapse of the civilian economy pushes the unemployed directly into the arms of the war industry. The most cynical thing is that new business models arise from this misery. In Russia, courses circulate teaching women how to quickly marry a soldier just to later collect state compensations after his death. Some have repeated this process several times. Soldier, wedding, funeral, wait, collect, repeat. Putin's propaganda often talks about innovation, but this macabre industry is perhaps the cruelest example of creative adaptation to a doomed system. Meanwhile, Moscow's costs continue to rise month after month. Putin is forced to constantly increase incentives for recruits just to gather fighters. At the same time, revenues decrease as oil and gas exports are blocked or destroyed. The Russian Ministry of Finance faces an almost impossible dilemma. Expenses grow uncontrollably, while income falls dramatically. In an act of desperation, the government considers new measures that could further fuel popular discontent. Mandatory tolls on all roads and increased taxes on citizens and businesses are being considered. Internal resistance is strong, but the Kremlin seems to have no other alternatives. Here lies the full contradiction of Putin's policy. While the country teeters on economic collapse, the Kremlin dreams of boosting growth as if prosperity could be generated by orders from the presidential palace alone. In official meetings, Putin asks his ministers to increase growth rates, while millions are allocated to the arms industry and billions are lost due to drone attacks. Western experts watch these scenes with disbelief because Russia no longer has viable strategic options. Ukrainian drone attacks have changed the game by targeting not only refineries but also the main export routes of Russian oil. Every port hit in Novorossiysk or every fleet of damaged tankers means less oil can be sold to India or China. These countries are precisely Putin's most important financial sources. However, distrust is growing in those same places. India's trade volume with Russia is threatened by secondary sanctions, and even China hesitates, not wanting to risk its own export markets in the United States and Europe. Former President Donald Trump has clearly identified this situation. His threat to impose secondary sanctions on countries like India and China represents a direct blow to the Kremlin. Even more dangerous for Putin was that, in response, he showed willingness to engage in dialogue following the announcement of new measures by Trump. Officially, the Kremlin maintains that the sanctions have no effect, but reality tells a different story. The numbers don't lie. With just the recent drone attacks, Russia could have lost $600 million in just 1 month. Moreover, although the arms industry is booming, the rest of the economy is in ruins. Supermarkets raise prices week after week. Small businesses are closing en masse, and the middle class is being pushed into poverty. The Kremlin tries to plug fiscal holes with tax hikes and new levies, but the population's patience has limits. Growing discontent is already apparent over the possible implementation of tolls on all roads. Putin's opponents interpret this as a clear sign that not even the most basic state functions can be financed with usual taxes. All this undermines Putin's central narrative, that he is the guarantor of stability. Instead of stability, chaos reigns. Instead of prosperity, expropriations prevail. That's why the similarities with the Soviet past are so evident. Once the Soviet Union, always the Soviet Union. That phrase from the text perfectly sums up the current situation. The oligarchs disappear like in the darkest days of the USSR. The economy is under centralized control, and those who dare to try to leave the country are detained, even if that means holding billionaires directly on the plane. It is an image of decay deeply rooted in Russian society. The big question is how long such a system can hold up. Pressure is already mounting on all fronts: military, economic, and political. This tension intensifies even more on the international stage, where Putin finds himself increasingly isolated. Even nations he considered allies are beginning to show doubts. Europe appears more united than ever before. The transatlantic alliance has strengthened, and NATO has not cut defense spending but increased it. Rather than weakening the alliance, Putin has doubled it. Literally, because with the inclusion of Finland and Sweden, he has expanded his border with NATO instead of reducing it. Strategic goals once considered secure have taken a complete turn. Meanwhile, Ukraine is moving ever closer to the West economically, politically, and culturally. What Putin tried to prevent, his own policy has accelerated. But what does this mean for the Russian population? Daily life is marked by scarcity and uncertainty. Those with money try to get it out of the country. Those without resources must choose between working for minimum wages or submitting to the war system. Soldiers, who barely survive more than 9 days on the front, have become the symbol of a nation sacrificing its youth in the trenches. At the same time, absurd phenomena arise. Women marrying soldiers with the aim of collecting compensation after their death. A cynical business with life and death that is not found in any economics manual but is part of daily reality in Putin's home. The media present all this as a sign of innovation. However, in reality, it is a desperate system that educates its citizens to be opportunists and survivors. The economy, which once relied on oil and gas revenues, now depends entirely on war. Ammunition for tanks and drones are the latest products generating growth while consumer goods factories are closing their doors. The middle class is impoverishing. The rich flee or die, and the state responds with even stricter controls. Capital flight has become a crime pursued by law. Gold exports have been banned, and at the last moment, oligarchs were prevented from boarding their planes. In this scenario, Putin appears as a mix between a weak leader and an uncompromising figure of power. On one hand, he begs his ministers, in almost absurd scenes, to boost economic growth. On the other, he applies a heavy hand without hesitation when it comes to property. This image is far from the myth of the strongman he has cultivated for decades. Rather, it reveals a president who is losing control and responds only with repression. The great unknown is how long such a system can hold before collapsing from within. History teaches us that dictatorships can endure for a long time, even amid chaos. Mao survived devastating famines. Saddam Hussein kept his people under sanctions for decades, but in the end, his fall was sudden and irreversible. Russia, under Putin, now finds itself in a similar crossroads. It can confiscate $50 billion from oligarchs, attract recruits with million-dollar contracts, impose new taxes on its citizens, but all this is just a patch on a mortal wound. Revenues decline faster than they can be replaced, and the cost of war rises without limit. Every drone attack on refineries and ports is a blow to his power base. Every fallen soldier, another crack in the foundations of his rule. The world watches closely, and the question remains whether Russia will break under Putin's obstinacy or if he will find a way out that drags the country even further into darkness. Above all, what does this struggle mean for all of us? For the global economy, for Europe's stability, and for the delicate balance between East and West? Will this war be Putin's last chapter, or just the beginning of an even greater conflict?